All right, hello and welcome to Chapter 17. We're going to talk about the conclusion of the Civil War and its impacts. Go ahead and write down the key terms. Make sure that you're able to define all of these key terms by the end of listening to these slides and taking notes on them, not just knowing the definition, but also remembering what's their historical significance, are there any social, economic, or political impacts as well. Okay, so let's start with the Emancipation Proclamation. This was an executive order signed into being on January 1st, 1863 by President Lincoln. An executive order is a law, but it's different from laws that are passed by Congress because this is kind of a decree or rule that's directly passed from the president that gets implemented. And usually you see executive orders being passed in times of crises or war, for example, when there are dire straits. So, essentially, what the Emancipation Proclamation did was to free the slaves in all rebelling states, the remaining 10 states in the Confederacy. It didn't free any states in the border states like Virginia, not Virginia, excuse me, Maryland. Virginia was a part of the Confederacy. But it did not outlaw slavery, and it didn't address the issue of whether or not freedmen, which is the term for freed slaves, didn't address the issue of whether or not they would be citizens and what would kind of happen to them after they were freed. Why did Lincoln do this, several years into the war? Yes, he was opposed to slavery and was against slavery, but as Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army, which is the role of the president, he felt as though it was a tactical move, that he could further weaken and harm the Confederacy by taking away a potential workforce and a potential military force. So at first it was tactical, but there were anti-slavery sentiments behind it. So abolitionists were constantly pressuring Lincoln to be more decisive about taking a stand against slavery, and so that was a huge cause as well. So the two major causes were influenced by the abolitionists and effective strategy to weaken the Confederate Army. And that last one was pretty successful. Lee felt as though that was a crippling thing that Lincoln did, and he made a request for more troops that went unheard and unfulfilled. And so there were some ways in which it was very disadvantageous to the South. What were the impacts? Firstly, it was symbolic. It really made people feel as though this war actually did have to do with slavery, because for the first part of the war, it wasn't necessarily about slavery for the North. It was about keeping America together. And once the Emancipation Proclamation comes into being, you see it as being, more of America turning towards more democratic society. It also empowered slaves. In total, there were about 3.5 to 4 million slaves in the southern states that were capable or that could have been liberated. However, only 30 to 40,000 were actually liberated, and those were slaves in areas that were held under Union control, right? Because if you have slaves deep in the heart of the South that is controlled by the Confederate States, the North isn't going to have access to them to go ahead and liberate them. So that's also why it was symbolic. Slaves could also join the Union Army and Navy, and the military reacted to this in a few different ways. Some units within the military, they were happy and they, warmly welcomed the freedmen into their ranks. However, many were upset and felt as though it was inappropriate to have freedmen fighting side by them. So it was definitely controversial. Okay, so just taking a further look at the responses to the Emancipation Proclamation, abolitionists were generally happy. The only reason why they weren't extremely happy was because they felt as though this didn't do enough. They wanted to see that freedmen would get citizenship and enfranchisement, and that there was a plan to take care of them. Northern Democrats were angry because they felt as though it prolonged the war and made things more complicated than they need to be. Union soldiers, like I said, for the most part, were happy because it was going to weaken the Confederacy. White Southerners were obviously outraged, and black Southerners, of course, supported it, and many of them chose to enlist and fight alongside the Union. Okay, so there are some economic changes that are taking place. These relate to the South most specifically. Let me write that down. Okay, so the South is going through immense food shortages, inflation is taking place. The Southern economy is devastated by the Civil War. Their currency is pretty much worthless. The Northern economy is doing great, though, because they've got all the factories and they're producing things, and so they're still making money and they're doing well. But the South is not doing well because they relied so heavily on trade and exporting their goods that during the war they're not able to do that, and it really hurts them. So you see that, and you kind of then start to see that the blockade is really a success. Also, during the Civil War, the income tax is established as a means of generating revenue for the United States government, and prior to it hadn't existed before. There are also some political changes that take place. As I mentioned before, the Emancipation Proclamation takes place, but Lincoln also took a lot of measures that could be considered undemocratic. However, he justified them as saying, this is a time of war, this is a time of crises, and I need to make sure that I have enough power to properly take care of the United States. So, one of the things he did was suspending habeas corpus, which is your trial rights and your rights as a prisoner. So, for example, if you're arrested in the United States, you have to be read your rights, and there has to be a just cause. There has to be a reason why the government is arresting you. During the Civil War, Lincoln suspended that. So, he used that liberally to arrest members of the Confederacy and hold them without trial. Let's see. There was a social and economic divide further in the South. Women got more and more responsibility, and especially in the North, they had more social standing because of the fact that so many men were off at war. And that's kind of a theme throughout many wars, is that as the men are off fighting, women kind of get to stand up and take more political and economic control over themselves. The conditions at prison camps on both sides were horrendously horrible and hellish. Many prisoners were in parts of the jails that weren't even covered or sheltered, so if it were raining, if it were snowing, whatever, they'd be exposed to all the elements. They were overcrowded, they weren't properly fed, there was torture. It was pretty miserable. Just like kind of the military tents at the Civil War, you didn't want to be there, you also didn't want to be a prisoner of war in the Civil War as well. Okay, so a timeline of the major events in the Civil War. You've got the Battle at Fredericksburg, which led to the death of Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate general. How did he die? His arm had to be amputated. His arm was wounded. He had to be amputated and died shortly thereafter of pneumonia. We have Gettysburg in July of 1863. The Union effectively pushed off Pickett's charge, which was the South's attempt at kind of pushing the Northern defenses back, but they were unsuccessful. In 1864, Sherman launches something called Total War. So he goes to war not only with the Confederate Army, but with the people, men, women, children that weren't even fighting in war. And I think I mentioned before this whole scorched earth strategy he had, that he burnt everything. He burnt a clear path from Atlanta all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. We have Grant focusing on Virginia. That wasn't successful, and then he ends up surrendering at the Appomattox Courthouse. All right, so Gettysburg. Let's talk now for a little bit about Gettysburg. Gettysburg is considered to be the turning point of the Civil War for the Union forces. The Battle of Gettysburg was a part of the Gettysburg Campaign, which was a series of battles fought between June and July of 1863. However, Gettysburg itself was the Battle of Gettysburg itself, the most famous one, was fought between July 1st and 3rd. In total, the American forces had about 90,000 troops, and in total, the Confederate forces had about 75,000 troops. Throughout this entire campaign, the Union lost about 30,000 men, whereas the Confederate States lost about 27,000 men. So this whole campaign was really bloody and really took a toll on either side. Gettysburg itself the Battle of Gettysburg has the highest number of casualties of any battle in the Civil War. As I mentioned before, it was the turning point. So we've got the Union, who was kind of losing and struggling before, now have become the winning side. Okay, General Lee, Robert E. Lee, led the Confederate forces in this battle, and prior to Gettysburg, Lee had a really stellar record of victories. He was such a strong leader, and it was said that if you were at war with Lee, you were probably going to lose because he was so strong. So what happened? What made Lee and his men kind of unsuccessful? Well, first off, Lee was thought to be kind of overconfident. He had such a good track record of beating Union forces that he felt, we'll just defeat the Union forces at Gettysburg, and then we'll continue on north, and we'll push, north and take control of the north. That didn't happen. He overestimated his troops' ability at the time. Also, there was mismanagement that took place amongst troops beneath him or the other generals that he was commanding. One example of this was Jeb Stuart. He kind of just didn't necessarily listen to Lee and led troops away, and obviously Lee really needed numbers, and so that hurt him. Also, the Union performed really strong. The first general that led the campaign at Gettysburg was General Hooker, and he was relieved of duty, and he was replaced by General Meade. Meade was really strong and really just pushed right back, pushed the Confederacy right back. So, looking at the first, there's only 3 days of Gettysburg, but looking at day one, the day 1 and 2, the Confederacy makes a really strong showing, and they even push back Union defenses so far that they run scattered through the streets of Gettysburg. However, on day 3, a Confederate General Pickett leads a charge, thinking we're just once again going to push through the Union forces, we're going to have them scatter again. However, Meade, like I said, was really strong and really prepared, and as he saw the Confederate forces charging, he had his men launch an attack of artillery, so launching cannons and rifle, and just showered them with their... All right, so yeah, they pushed back Pickett's charge. It was unsuccessful, and ultimately the Union ends up winning Gettysburg. So, for the actual number of casualties in Gettysburg, you've got about 23,000 on the Union side and once again, 25,000 on the Confederate side. Remember, that's the number of casualties. That's not necessarily the number of total deaths. About 15,000 on each side were from wounds, and about 4,000 to 5,000 on each side was about actual deaths. But you have to consider that people were missing in action and that a lot of those wounds were fatal. So, yeah. A result was that Lee retreated back to Virginia, and in November of that year, on November 19th, actually, Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, that very, very famous speech that kind of changed the tone of the war. Okay. Another historically significant event was the passage of the 13th Amendment, which banned involuntary servitude, which essentially banned slavery, okay, because slavery is involuntary servitude. You were being forced to work against your will. Lincoln is also assassinated, and that's a huge setback for the unification of America. And when you look at how Reconstruction takes place, and Reconstruction is the time period of rebuilding after the Civil War, you kind of feel and see how much of a strong leader and presence Lincoln was, and the way that Reconstruction takes place, you kind of wonder what things had been like if Lincoln had been alive to kind of oversee Reconstruction. But that's our task for Chapter 18, which we will get to when we get back from Christmas. So Now you have all of the facts and information, the basic facts and information about the Civil War, and after we do Chapter 17, we're going to spend a lot of time delving into primary sources and doing debates and doing a lot more hands-on analysis of the war itself. So congratulations, you got through the hard part. Now we're going to have fun exploring the Civil War. Have a great day.